Hello, you tired little peeps. It's that time once again. So let's snuggle up fast, because tonight we're traveling back in time to wander the quiet corridors of the Palatine Hill, observing the hidden conspiracies and the final moments of Rome's most powerful rulers. So if you are new to the channel or returning, liking the video significantly helps. Also, please let me know where you're listening in from and what time it is for you. Now get comfortable and let's begin. To understand the nature of assassination in the Roman Empire, one must first understand the peculiar nature of the office of the emperor itself. It was not a position originally designed to exist within the framework of the Roman constitution. The Republic, which had stood for centuries, was built on the idea of shared power, of temporary magistrates, and the abhorrence of kings. When Augustus, the first emperor, consolidated power, he did so not by claiming a crown, but by accumulating existing republican titles. He was the princeps, the first citizen. He held the tribunician power to veto and the proconsular imperium to command the legions. But because the position was theoretically a collection of emergency powers granted by the Senate, there was never a clearly defined law of succession in the early empire. This legal ambiguity created a structural vulnerability that would plague Rome for centuries. If there is no legal way to remove a ruler who has become a tyrant or who is simply incompetent, then the only method of removal becomes extra-legal. Assassination, in the context of Roman politics, was often viewed by its perpetrators not merely as murder, but as a political corrective measure. It was the ultimate vote of no confidence. The safety of the emperor, therefore, did not rely solely on the law, but on the loyalty of those physically closest to him: the Praetorian Guard, the freedmen who managed the palace bureaucracy, and the members of his own household. When these layers of protection failed, the emperor was exposed. Before we look at the emperors themselves, we must briefly acknowledge the event that set the precedent for imperial removal, though it happened technically before the empire formally began. The assassination of Julius Caesar on the Ides of March in 44 BC established a pattern that would echo through history. It occurred not in a dark alley, but in a meeting of the Senate, held in the theater of Pompey. The conspirators were not foreign agents, but colleagues and friends. The narrative of that day is well known, but it serves as a reminder that the greatest danger to a Roman leader often stood within arm's reach. The 23 wounds inflicted on Caesar were a collaborative effort, a shared responsibility among the elite who felt their status was threatened. This dynamic, the fear of the aristocracy losing relevance, would become a recurring motif in the lives and deaths of the Caesars who followed. The first true emperor to fall victim to a successful assassination plot after the establishment of the Principate was Caligula, officially known as Gaius. His reign had begun with immense popularity, a welcome change from the gloomy final years of Tiberius. However, the atmosphere in Rome shifted as the years progressed. The administration became erratic. The relationship between the princeps and the Senate deteriorated, but it was not the Senate that would strike the final blow. It was the Praetorian Guard, the very body tasked with his protection. The conspiracy against Caligula was born out of personal grievances and a sense of insulted honor. Cassius Chaerea, a tribune of the Praetorian Guard, became the primary architect of the plot. Chaerea was an experienced soldier, a veteran who had served in the Germanic campaigns. The sources tell us that Caligula frequently mocked Chaerea's voice and mannerisms, using derogatory passwords for the daily watch that Chaerea had to repeat to his subordinates. This personal humiliation combined with a broader concern for the stability of the state, drove the tribune to action. The date was January 24th, 41 AD. It was the final day of the Ludi Palatini, the games held on the Palatine Hill in honor of the divine Augustus. The setting was bustling and noisy, filled with theater performances and public festivities. This public chaos provided the necessary cover for a private act of violence. Around noon, Caligula decided to leave the theater to bathe and have lunch. There were two routes available to him. He could follow the open road with his entourage, or he could take a private, subterranean gallery, a cryptoporticus, that connected the imperial palaces. He chose the cryptoporticus. The narrow, enclosed space of the corridor neutralized the advantage of numbers that his Germanic bodyguards usually provided. As Caligula stopped to speak with a group of noble youths from Asia who were rehearsing a performance, the conspirators made their move. Chaerea struck first, delivering a blow between the neck and the shoulder. It was a signal. The other conspirators, including the tribune Cornelius Sabinus, closed in within the confined stone walls of the passage. The emperor fell. The silence of the cryptoporticus returned, broken only by the footsteps of the assassins fleeing the scene before the Germanic guards could arrive. The immediate aftermath of Caligula's death illustrates the chaos that follows a power vacuum. The Senate briefly debated restoring the Republic, dreaming of a return to the old ways. The Praetorian Guard, however, knew that their privileged position depended on the existence of an emperor. In the confusion, they found Claudius, Caligula's uncle, hiding behind a curtain in the palace, terrified that he too would be killed. Instead of assassinating him, they hailed him as emperor. The guard had realized that they were the kingmakers. Claudius, despite being brought to power in such a precarious manner, ruled for 13 years. His administration was marked by significant expansion of the bureaucracy and the empire itself, including the conquest of Britain. Yet, his domestic life was a source of constant danger. He survived several plots during his reign, but the threat that finally ended him came from within his immediate family. By 54 AD, Claudius was married to his niece, Agrippina the Younger. Agrippina was a formidable political operator with a singular goal: to ensure the succession of her son, Nero, over Claudius's biological son, Britannicus. As Claudius aged, there were signs that he favored Britannicus more and more, perhaps regretting his marriage to Agrippina. For Agrippina, time was running out. She needed to act before Britannicus came of age and assumed the toga virilis, the symbol of manhood. The method chosen was poison, a weapon that allows for plausible deniability, or at least a quiet transition. The accounts of the event vary slightly in detail, but the consensus among ancient historians like Tacitus and Suetonius points to a specific meal. It was October 13th, 54 AD. The dish in question was a plate of mushrooms, a favorite delicacy of the emperor. The poison was reportedly prepared by Locusta, a notorious professional poisoner who appears in the records of this period as a dark specialist in her trade. The delivery mechanism was the food itself. It is said that the poison was sprinkled on a particularly succulent mushroom. However, the assassination did not go entirely to plan. Claudius, perhaps due to the amount of wine he had consumed or a natural constitution, did not die immediately. He suffered from gastric distress, but seemed to be recovering. This moment of uncertainty required a secondary intervention. The emperor's physician, Xenophon, was present. In the ancient world, the line between healer and assassin could be perilously thin. Under the guise of helping the emperor vomit to clear his stomach, a common medical practice of the time, Xenophon is alleged to have introduced a feather down Claudius's throat, but the feather was coated with a rapid-acting poison. This final measure proved effective. The death of Claudius was kept secret for several hours. The palace doors remained shut. Official reports were issued stating that the emperor was improving, while inside, the transfer of power was being arranged. Agrippina delayed the announcement until the auspicious moment of noon. When the palace gates finally opened, it was Nero who emerged to be greeted by the Praetorian Guard. The transition was complete. The quiet, bureaucratic removal of Claudius demonstrated that the most dangerous place for an emperor was often his own dining table, surrounded by his wife and doctors. Nero's accession brought a new era, but the cycle of violence did not end. It merely paused. Nero himself would eventually face the consequences of losing the support of the military and the Senate. However, his end was not a simple assassination, but a forced suicide, driven by a revolt that shattered the illusion of stability. Following Nero's death in 68 AD, the Julio-Claudian dynasty collapsed, plunging Rome into the year of the four emperors. This was a period of civil war where assassination and battlefield death became indistinguishable. Galba, Otho, and Vitellius all met violent ends within months of each other. Galba, an old and severe disciplinarian, was lynched in the Roman Forum by the Praetorian Guard, who had been bribed by Otho. Otho, facing defeat in battle against Vitellius, took his own life. Vitellius was dragged through the streets of Rome and killed on the Gemonian stairs. This year of chaos taught the Roman elite a valuable lesson. The secret of the empire was out. Emperors could be made elsewhere than at Rome, but once Vespasian established the Flavian dynasty, a semblance of order returned. The assassination of Domitian, the younger son of Vespasian, in 96 AD, returns us to the classic pattern of the palace conspiracy. Domitian was an efficient administrator but deeply paranoid and autocratic. He insisted on being addressed as Dominus et Deus, Master and God. He purged the Senate and maintained a reign of terror that alienated those closest to him. As with Caligula, the plot against Domitian was born from the fear of his own household staff. The conspiracy involved his wife, Domitia Longina, the two prefects of the Praetorian Guard, and various freedmen who managed his private chambers. They knew their names were on a list of suspects Domitian intended to execute. They decided to strike first. The detailed planning of Domitian's death reveals the intimacy of these crimes. The conspirators approached Stephanus, a steward of Domitian's niece. Stephanus was willing to act because he was currently facing charges for embezzlement and needed a way out. For several days before the attack, Stephanus feigned an injury to his arm, wearing a heavy wool wrapping or bandage. This was not merely for show. The bandage concealed a dagger. On September 18th, Stephanus was granted an audience with the emperor under the pretense of revealing a conspiracy. While Domitian was reading a document Stephanus had handed him, Stephanus produced the dagger from his bandages and stabbed the emperor in the groin. Domitian, unlike some of his predecessors, did not die quietly. He was 44 years old and physically vigorous. He fought back. He grappled with Stephanus, attempting to wrestle the dagger away and gouge out the assassin's eyes. The struggle was desperate and bloody. However, the other conspirators, including a gladiator and several Imperial freedmen, rushed into the room and finished the job. Domitian was hacked to death. The death of Domitian marked the end of the Flavian dynasty and, significantly, led to the appointment of Nerva by the Senate. This began the era of the 5 good emperors, a period often characterized by stability and the peaceful transfer of power through adoption. For nearly a century, assassination seemed to recede as the primary method of succession. Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius all died of natural causes. It was a golden age of administrative continuity. But this stability was fragile, resting entirely on the temperament of the ruler and his ability to select a worthy successor. When Marcus Aurelius broke with the tradition of adoption and chose his biological son, Commodus, to succeed him, the old ghosts of the Palatine returned. Commodus was not interested in the drudgery of administration. He saw himself as a gladiator, a Hercules reborn. His erratic behavior and cruelty revived the atmosphere of fear that had existed under Caligula and Domitian. The first major attempt on Commodus's life occurred early in his reign, in 182 AD. It was a plot orchestrated by his own sister, Lucilla. The plan was simple. An assassin would wait in the darkness of the entrance to the amphitheater. As Commodus entered, the assassin, a man named Quintianus, stepped out from the shadows. Instead of striking immediately, however, he paused to announce his dramatic intent, shouting, "The Senate sends you this." This theatrical delay cost him his opportunity. The guards seized him before the blade could make contact. The attempt failed, but it deepened Commodus's paranoia and hatred of the Senate. For the next decade, Commodus ruled through fear. But inevitably, the circle of trust around him shrank until it included only his mistress Marcia, his chamberlain Eclectus, and the Praetorian prefect Latus. And just like with Domitian, these three eventually discovered that they were scheduled for execution. On New Year's Eve, 192 AD, they decided to act. Marcia was the first to attempt the assassination. Following the tradition of Agrippina, she poisoned the emperor's wine after his bath. Commodus drank the wine and felt ill. He retreated to his bedroom to vomit. The conspirators, fearing that he would expel the poison and survive to exact revenge, realized that poison was not enough. They needed a more direct method. They contacted Narcissus, a professional athlete and Commodus's wrestling partner. Narcissus was brought into the bedroom where the emperor lay groggy and sick. There were no weapons involved in this final act. Narcissus, with his immense strength, simply strangled the emperor in his bed. The murder of Commodus ended the Antonine dynasty and triggered the Year of the Five Emperors, another period of civil war that mirrored the chaos of 69 AD. From this wreckage emerged Septimius Severus, a hard, pragmatic general from North Africa. He established a new dynasty, the Severans, but the precedent of violence had been firmly reinforced. The imperial purple was now, more than ever, a garment stained with blood. We have now seen the early mechanics of assassination. The dagger in the Senate, the sword in the cryptoporticus, the poisoned mushroom, and the strangler in the bedroom. These were intimate crimes, committed within the physical confines of the palace. But as the empire evolved, so too did the nature of the threats against the emperor. The danger began to move outward, from the dining room to the military camp. This shift towards the military camp as the locus of imperial mortality became painfully evident in the immediate aftermath of Commodus's death. The year 193 AD is known as the Year of the Five Emperors, a designation that statistically implies a high turnover rate and a correspondingly low life expectancy for the job holder. The man chosen to succeed. Commodus was Pertinax, a highly respected elderly senator with a long career of service. He was the distinct opposite of the gladiator emperor. He was frugal, disciplined, and intent on restoring order to the finances of the state. Unfortunately, Restoring financial order meant curbing the extravagances of the Praetorian Guard. Pertinax refused to pay the exorbitant donatives, the cash bonuses that the soldiers had come to expect as their due. He attempted to impose strict discipline on men who had grown accustomed to license. The result was predictable. On March 28, 1930 AD, after a reign of only 87 days, a contingent of 300 soldiers marched on the Imperial Palace. They were not sneaking in through secret corridors or poisoning wine. They marched openly. The palace servants did not stop them. Pertinax, displaying a stoic bravery, walked out to meet them, attempting to reason with the mutineers. For a moment, it seemed his authority might hold. But a soldier from the Tungrian auxiliary cohort struck him in the chest with a lance. The spell was broken, and the rest of the soldiers fell upon him. His head was put on a lance and paraded to the Praetorian camp. What followed was one of the most disgraceful episodes in Roman history, an event that stripped away any remaining illusion that the emperor ruled by divine right or senatorial consent. The Praetorian Guard, having killed the legal head of state, effectively put the empire up for auction to the highest bidder. Two contenders appeared: Titus Flavius Sulpicianus, the city prefect, and Didius Julianus, a wealthy senator. They bid against each other at the walls of the camp, shouting out larger and larger sums of promised gold to the soldiers inside. Julianus won the auction by promising 25,000 sestertii to every soldier. He purchased the throne, but he could not purchase loyalty. He was executed in the palace just 66 days later, abandoned by the very guards he had bribed, as the legions of Septimius Severus approached Rome. Septimius Severus brought a temporary stability, largely by militarizing the government and explicitly favoring the army. His dying advice to his sons, Caracalla and Geta, was famously direct: be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all other men. It was a survival strategy based on the recognition that the sword was now the only pillar of the state. However, the first part of his advice, to be harmonious, was ignored. The relationship between Caracalla and Geta was poisonous. In 211 AD, ostensibly meeting for a reconciliation arranged by their mother, Julia Domna, Caracalla had centurions rush into the room. Geta was stabbed to death while clinging to his mother. Caracalla was now the sole ruler. He was a soldier's emperor, spending most of his time on campaign, eating the same rough food as his men and digging trenches alongside them. One might assume this would grant him immunity from assassination by his own troops. But the intimate nature of the imperial entourage meant that personal grudges could still be fatal, regardless of broader popularity. In 217 AD, Caracalla was campaigning in the east against the Parthians. On April 8th, he was traveling from Edessa to visit a temple of the moon god near Cari. The journey was mundane. At one point, the emperor needed to relieve himself. He signaled his bodyguard to hang back and dismounted his horse to find privacy by the roadside. Among his officers was a man named Julius Martialis. Martialis was a veteran soldier who harbored a deep, simmering resentment against Caracalla. The emperor had recently denied him a promotion to the rank of centurion, and there were rumors that Caracalla had been involved in the execution of Martialis's cousin. This administrative slight, a denied promotion, was the catalyst. As Caracalla squatted on the ground, vulnerable and exposed, Martialis approached him, ostensibly to ask a question or deliver a message. Instead, he drew a dagger and stabbed the emperor in the back. Caracalla died instantly in the dust of the roadside. The assassin, Martialis, tried to flee, but was killed seconds later by a Scythian archer from the Imperial Guard. It was a sordid, unheroic end for a man who fancied himself a second Alexander the Great. The mastermind behind this assassination was likely Macrinus, the Praetorian prefect. Macrinus knew that Caracalla had a prophecy that he, Macrinus, would become emperor, and he feared Caracalla would execute him to prevent it. With Caracalla dead, Macrinus did indeed take the throne, becoming the first emperor who was not of the senatorial class, but his reign was short. The Severan dynasty still had powerful women working in the background, specifically Julia Maesa, the sister of Julia Domna. She engineered a coup to place her grandson, Elagabalus, on the throne. Elagabalus is perhaps the most exotic figure to ever wear the purple. He was a hereditary high priest of the Syrian sun god, El-Gabal. He was 14 years old when he became emperor in 218 AD. His reign was a 4-year spectacle of religious upheaval and shattered taboos. He replaced Jupiter with his foreign sun god, married a Vestal virgin, and engaged in behavior that shocked conservative Roman sensibilities. But ultimately, it was not his morality that got him killed. It was his incompetence and his alienation of the Praetorian Guard. His grandmother, Julia Maesa, realizing that Elagabalus was becoming a liability, convinced him to adopt his cousin, Alexander Severus, as his heir. Alexander was young, docile, and popular with the soldiers. Everything Elagabalus was not. Jealous of his cousin's rising popularity, Elagabalus made several clumsy attempts to have Alexander assassinated. This turned the Guard against him completely. On March 11, 222 AD, Elagabalus visited the Praetorian camp to quell a disturbance. The soldiers cheered for Alexander and ignored the emperor. Enraged, Elagabalus ordered the arrest of the insubordinate troops. It was a fatal miscalculation. The soldiers turned on him. Elagabalus attempted to flee, hiding in a latrine, a grim parallel to the unglamorous deaths of many of his predecessors. He was dragged out and killed. His mother, Julia Soaemias, who had encouraged his religious extravagances, was also slain. Their bodies were dragged through the streets of Rome. Elagabalus's corpse was thrown into the Tiber River, the ultimate Roman insult, denying him a proper burial. Alexander Severus, now the sole emperor, ruled for 13 years. It was a period of relative calm, guided by his mother, Julia Mamaea. However, the dynamic that killed Pertinax re-emerged. Alexander was seen as too intellectual, too dependent on his mother, and, most fatally, too hesitant in war. In 235 AD, the emperor was on the Rhine frontier, facing a Germanic invasion. The soldiers wanted to fight and plunder. Alexander, preferring diplomacy, attempted to buy off the Germanic tribes to secure peace. To the legions, this was cowardice. It was an insult to their martial pride and, more importantly, a denial of potential loot. A giant of a man named Maximinus Thrax, a low-born soldier of immense physical strength who had risen through the ranks, began to agitate against the emperor. The troops proclaimed Maximinus emperor. Alexander, hearing the tumult, rushed out of his tent to address the men, but it was too late. He fled back to his tent, where he clung to his mother, reportedly crying and blaming her for his misfortunes. The soldiers entered the tent and killed them both. The death of Alexander Severus in 235 AD is traditionally marked as the beginning of the crisis of the 3rd century. This was a 50-year period where the assassination of emperors ceased to be an anomaly and became the standard operating procedure for political transition. The empire fractured. Plague, inflation, and invasion tore at the borders. In the center, a revolving door of generals seized the throne, only to be murdered by their own men when the next crisis arose or the money ran out. Maximinus Thrax, the man who replaced Alexander, was the first emperor who never set foot in Rome during his reign. He ruled from the camp. His harsh tax policies to fund his wars made him hated by the Senate and the civilians. In 238 AD, the Senate rebelled, leading to a confusing sequence known as the Year of the Six Emperors. Maximinus marched on Italy to crush the rebellion. However, his siege of the city of Aquileia went poorly. His soldiers, starving and demoralized, and fearing for their families back in Italy, decided they had had enough. Soldiers of the Second Parthica Legion entered his tent while he was resting and killed him, along with his son. They cut off their heads and sent them to Rome as a peace offering to the Senate. Back in Rome, the Senate had appointed two of their own, Balbinus and Pupienus, as co-emperors. They were elderly, experienced men, meant to represent the restoration of senatorial authority. But the Praetorian Guard resented being sidelined by the Senate. They viewed these two old men as symbols of an obsolete aristocracy. The end of Balbinus and Pupienus is a stark illustration of the power struggle between the civil and military branches of the state. It was midsummer, 238 AD. The Capitoline Games were being held, and the city was distracted. The Praetorians stormed the palace. The two emperors, who had been arguing with each other about who was to blame for the unrest, were seized. They were stripped naked and dragged roughly through the streets towards the Praetorian camp. They were beaten and tortured along the way, a public humiliation designed to show the people exactly where the true power lay. Finally, they were hacked to death and their bodies left in the street. From this point on, the life expectancy of an emperor dropped precipitously. Gordian III, who succeeded them, died under suspicious circumstances while campaigning in the east, likely killed by his successor Philip the Arab. Philip was then killed in battle against Decius. Decius, in a rare break from assassination, died fighting the Goths in the swamps of Abritus, the first emperor to die in battle against a foreign enemy. His successor, Trebonianus Gallus, was murdered by his own troops who were disgusted by his peace treaty with the Goths. Aemilianus, who replaced Gallus, lasted only 3 months before his soldiers killed him to avoid fighting the larger army of Valerian. It becomes almost repetitive, a numbing litany of violent deaths. The systemic instability meant that no emperor could plan for the long term. Trust was impossible. One figure from this chaotic era stands out not because he was assassinated, but because of the singular humiliation of his end. Valerian, ruling in the 250s, was captured alive by the Sassanid king Shapur I. He became the only Roman emperor to be taken as a prisoner of war. Accounts say he was used as a human footstool for the Persian king to mount his horse, and after he died in captivity, his skin was flayed, dyed red, and stuffed with straw as a trophy. While not an assassination in the Roman sense, it contributed to the shattering of the imperial mystique. His son, Gallienus, was left to pick up the pieces. Gallienus ruled for 15 years, a remarkable feat in that century. He was a reformer, attempting to modernize the cavalry and exclude senators from military command to prevent coups. Yet, he too fell to conspiracy. In 268 AD, while besieging the usurper Aureolus in Milan, a plot was hatched by his senior officers. They were frustrated by the endless civil wars. The conspirators included future emperors Claudius Gothicus and Aurelian. The assassination was executed with military efficiency. Late at night, a false report was brought to Gallienus that the enemy was launching a sortie. Without waiting for his bodyguards or donning his armor, Gallienus rushed out of his tent to organize the defense. In the darkness and confusion, the commander of his Dalmatian cavalry, a man named Cecropius, rode up and stabbed him. The emperor died in the dark, betrayed by the very men he had promoted to save the empire. As the 3rd century crisis wound down, a series of tough soldier emperors from the Illyrian provinces began to restore order. They were hard men, born in the Balkans, raised in the legions. Aurelian, known as Restitutor Orbis, reunited the fractured empire. He defeated the Palmyrene Empire in the east and the Gallic Empire in the west. He built the great walls around Rome that still stand today. One would think such a hero would be safe. But in 275 AD, Aurelian fell victim to a petty administrative lie. A secretary named Eros, fearing punishment for a minor error, forged a document. It was a list of names of officers Aurelian supposedly planned to execute. Eros showed this list to the officers in question. Believing they were doomed, they decided to strike first. As Aurelian marched towards the east to fight the Persians, waiting for a bridge to be crossed near Byzantium, his high-ranking officers surrounded him and cut him down. The man who had defeated armies and reunited the world was killed because a secretary was afraid of being reprimanded. This tragic misunderstanding highlights the atmosphere of terror that permeated the imperial court. When the penalty for failure is death and the ruler has absolute power, the incentive to assassinate becomes a rational survival mechanism for subordinates. With the rise of Diocletian in 284 AD, the Roman world finally found a way to pause the cycle of murder, at least for a time. Diocletian understood that the empire was too big for one man, and that the succession problem was the root of the instability. He created the Tetrarchy, the rule of 4, 2 senior emperors and 2 junior emperors. It was an elaborate system designed to ensure a smooth transfer of power and discourage assassination, as killing one emperor would simply bring 3 others down on the assassin. Diocletian's system worked while he was in charge. He even did the unthinkable. He retired. In 305 AD, he voluntarily stepped down and went to his palace in Split, Croatia, to grow cabbages. It was perhaps the only way for a Roman emperor to ensure he died in his bed of old age. But as soon as he left, the system collapsed. The ambitions of men like Constantine and Maxentius could not be contained by diagrams and titles. The collapse of the Tetrarchy plunged the empire back into civil war, a conflict that was ultimately resolved by Constantine the Great. Constantine's reign marked a fundamental shift, not just in religion with the embrace of Christianity, but in the structure of imperial safety. He founded a new capital, Constantinople, a city designed from the ground up to be a fortress for the emperor. The Great Palace of Constantinople was a city within a city, a maze of guarded courtyards and ceremonial halls that placed a physical distance between the ruler and the ruled. Yet, even in this new Christian empire, the old habits of Roman politics persisted. The family of Constantine was decimated by internal purges. He executed his own son, Crispus, and his wife, Fausta, in 326 AD. While these were executions ordered by the emperor, rather than assassinations of the emperor, they maintained the bloody atmosphere of the court. The sanctity of the imperial bloodline was no guarantee of safety. As the 4th century progressed, the threat to the emperor shifted once again. It was no longer just the Praetorian Guard or a disgruntled senator. It was the rise of powerful generals of barbarian origin, the magistri militum. These men effectively ran the army and, by extension, the state. They could not become emperors themselves due to their non-Roman or Arian Christian backgrounds, but they could make and unmake those who wore the purple. The death of the Emperor Gratian in 383 AD serves as a grim example of this era. Gratian was a young, somewhat detached ruler who preferred hunting in the company of his Hellenic bodyguards to the business of state. This alienated the Roman troops. When the general Magnus Maximus rebelled in Britain and crossed into Gaul, Gratian's army melted away. He fled towards Italy but was overtaken at Lugdunum. Gratian was invited to a dinner, ostensibly for a parley or a peaceful surrender. The invitation was delivered by Androgathius, Maximus's cavalry commander. Gratian, believing he was safe, or perhaps having no other choice, attended. It was a trap. He was assassinated at the banquet table. This violation of the laws of hospitality and the sanctity of the emperor's person signaled the declining power of the central authority. The emperor was becoming a pawn in the games of warlords. His half-brother, Valentinian II, met a similarly murky end. He was a young man, dominated by the Frankish general Arbogast. Valentinian attempted to assert his independence by handing Arbogast a dismissal notice. Arbogast contemptuously tore the document up in the emperor's face, stating, "You did not give me my command, and you cannot take it away." Shortly after this confrontation, on May 15th, 392 AD, Valentinian was found dead in his residence at Vienne. He was hanging in his room. Arbogast claimed it was suicide. However, the general consensus of the time, and of historians since, is that Arbogast had him strangled and then staged the scene. The puppet had tried to cut his strings, and the puppeteer had silenced him. The division of the empire into East and West in 395 AD created two different trajectories for imperial assassinations. In the West, the emperors became increasingly irrelevant, mere figureheads for generals like Stilicho, Aetius, and Ricimer. In the East, however, the civilian bureaucracy maintained control, but the court became a viper's nest of eunuchs, empresses, and ambitious bureaucrats. The West saw its final act of imperial violence play out in a rapid, pathetic succession. Majorian, one of the last competent emperors of the West, tried to reconquer the lost provinces. He was too successful for the liking of Ricimer, the powerful general behind the throne. In 461 AD, Ricimer intercepted Majorian near Tortona, arrested him, stripped him of his dress and diadem, beat him, and finally beheaded him 5 days later. The humiliation was the point. It was a public statement that the emperor existed only at the pleasure of the general. By 476 AD, when Romulus Augustulus was deposed, there was no need for assassination. The boy was simply sent away to a villa in Naples with a pension. The office of Western Emperor had become so meaningless that killing him wasn't worth the effort. In the East, however, the empire endured, and so did the tradition of conspiracy. The murder of the Emperor Leo II, or the suspicions surrounding the death of Zeno, show that the Byzantine court was just as dangerous as the Palatine had been. But let us look at a particularly instructive example from the 5th century in the East, the fate of the usurper Basiliscus. Basiliscus had seized the throne from Zeno in 475 AD. His reign was short and disastrous. A massive fire swept through Constantinople, destroying the great library and thousands of houses. The people rioted. Zeno, who had fled, returned with an army. Basiliscus, finding himself abandoned, sought sanctuary in the church of Hagia Sophia with his wife and children. He would only leave if Zeno promised not to shed their blood. Zeno, displaying the legalistic cruelty that often characterized Byzantine politics, agreed. He promised that no blood would be spilled. Basiliscus surrendered. Zeno was true to his word. He sent Basiliscus and his entire family to a fortress in Cappadocia. There, they were locked in a dried-out cistern. The entrance was walled up. They were left to die of thirst and starvation. No blood was shed. The letter of the oath was kept. The spirit was horrifyingly violated. This method of clean assassination, starvation, blinding, or forcing someone into a monastery, became more common in the East as Christianity made the direct shedding of royal blood more taboo, though no less frequent. As we move into the Byzantine period proper, the nature of the assassination attempts takes on a more theological and factional tone. The Nika riots in 532 AD against Justinian were not just a political revolt, but a massive explosion of violence fueled by chariot racing factions, the Blues and the Greens, that nearly toppled the emperor. Justinian survived only because his wife, Theodora, shamed him into staying, famously saying that imperial purple makes a fine burial shroud. He unleashed the army on the rioters in the Hippodrome, massacring 30,000 citizens. It wasn't an assassination of the emperor, but an assassination of the opposition by the emperor. However, let's jump forward to the murder of Emperor Maurice in 602 AD, an event that shattered the stability of the East and opened the door to the Persian and then Islamic conquests. Maurice was a capable general but a rigid disciplinarian. He ordered his troops, who were campaigning beyond the Danube, to winter in enemy territory to save money. The troops, exhausted and cold, mutinied. They raised a junior officer named Phocas on a shield. Phocas marched on Constantinople. Riots broke out in the city. Maurice, abandoned by everyone, fled across the Bosphorus to Nicomedia with his family. He was captured. The execution was gruesome and performed with a psychological cruelty designed to break the emperor before he died. Maurice was forced to watch his 6 sons be beheaded one by one. He was said to have prayed quietly as each boy died. Finally, Maurice himself was executed. Their bodies were thrown into the sea, and their heads were displayed in Constantinople. Phocas, the usurper, proved to be a paranoid tyrant. His reign was a bloodbath. He introduced the rack, the blinding, and mutilation as standard tools of statecraft. His incompetence eventually led the Exarch of Africa, Heraclius, to send his son to remove him. In 610 AD, Heraclius sailed into the Golden Horn. Phocas's own guards deserted him. He was dragged before Heraclius on the deck of his flagship. Heraclius looked at the disheveled, trembling tyrant and asked, "Is this how you have ruled the empire, wretch?" Phocas, showing a flash of defiant realism, replied, "And will you rule it any better?" Heraclius kicked him and famously beheaded him on the spot. Phocas's body was mutilated and burned. The cycle continued. The 7th and 8th centuries in Byzantium were particularly volatile. Emperors were frequently deposed, and the favored method of neutralization became rhinotomy, the amputation of the nose. The logic was biblical and legalistic. An emperor had to be physically perfect. A man with no nose could not be emperor. Justinian II is the most famous victim and survivor of this practice. Deposed in 695 AD, his nose was slit and he was exiled to Cherson in the Crimea. Most men would have withered away. Justinian II, however, was made of sterner, perhaps madder stuff. He had a gold prosthetic nose fashioned for himself. He escaped exile, allied with the Khazars and then the Bulgars, and marched back to Constantinople in 705 AD. He retook the city, terrified the population, and exacted a terrible revenge on his enemies. He would sit with his feet resting on the necks of the 2 usurpers who had ruled in his absence, presiding over the races in the Hippodrome before having them beheaded. But a reign built on vengeance is rarely stable. In 711 AD, another rebellion broke out. This time, there was no exile. Justinian II was abandoned by his army. He was arrested and simply beheaded. His 6-year-old son, Tiberius, was dragged from a church where he was clinging to the altar. A soldier stripped the boy of his holy relics and slit his throat on the church steps. The line of Heraclius was extinguished. The assassination of Leo V in 820 AD brings us back to the setting of the sacred, but with a violent twist that could only happen in Constantinople. Leo V, known as the Armenian, was a fierce iconoclast. He had imprisoned his former friend, Michael the Amorian, for treason and planned to execute him by burning him in the furnace of the palace baths. However, it was Christmas Eve. The empress pleaded for mercy, asking that the execution be delayed until after the holy day. Leo reluctantly agreed, but kept Michael in chains. Fearing that the delay meant death for them all, Michael's supporters infiltrated the palace. They disguised themselves as monks in the choir that was to sing the matin service in the palace chapel of St. Stephen. It was the deepest part of the winter night, Christmas morning. The emperor entered the chapel to sing. Leo fancied himself a good singer and loved to lead the chanting. As the service began, at a prearranged signal in the hymn, the monks drew swords from under their robes. In the dim candlelight, they mistook the officiating priest for the emperor initially, but Leo revealed himself. He was unarmed but grabbed a heavy cross from the altar to defend himself. He fought desperately, swinging the cross against the swords. But the assassins were too many. A blow shattered his arm, and another struck his head. He fell at the foot of the altar. Michael the Amorian was dragged from his cell, still in chains, and crowned emperor before the irons could even be hammered off his legs. This image, the emperor fighting with a cross in the palace chapel on Christmas morning against assassins dressed as monks, encapsulates the unique, suffocating atmosphere of the Byzantine court. The sacred and the profane were inextricably linked. As we move toward the later centuries of the empire, the assassinations become perhaps less frequent but no less dramatic. The sheer longevity of the Roman state in its eastern form meant that it had centuries to refine the art of the coup. One of the most notorious figures of the 10th century was Theophano, a woman of humble origins who rose to become empress. She is implicated in the deaths of 2 emperors. First, her husband Romanos II, who died young and suddenly, possibly by poison. Then, she married the great general Nikephoros Phocas to protect her children's rights to the throne. Nikephoros was a brilliant soldier, the pale death of the Saracens, but he was an ascetic, unromantic man who slept on the floor on a panther skin rather than in the imperial bed. Theophano took a lover, another general named John Zimisces. Together, they plotted against Nikephoros. On a snowy night in December 969 AD, conspirators were hoisted up the sea walls of the Bucolion Palace in a basket. They hid in the empress's chambers. Nikephoros was asleep on the floor in the next room. The assassins burst in. Nikephoros woke up, but was struck in the head. He was dragged to the feet of John Zimisces, who cursed him. The old general was then stabbed to death. Zimisces became emperor, but the Patriarch of Constantinople refused to crown him until he banished Theophano. The femme fatale of the piece found herself exiled, the ultimate loser in the game she had helped orchestrate. The assassination of Nikephoros Phocas was a turning point, reinforcing the idea that military glory was no shield against domestic treachery. However, as the empire moved into the 11th century, the role of the empress and the civil bureaucracy became even more pronounced in the orchestration of imperial deaths. We enter an era where the dangers were not just swords in the night, but the slow, quiet machinations of the bedchamber and the bathhouse. Consider the fate of Romanos III Argyros, who ruled in the early 11th century. Romanos was the husband of the Empress Zoe Porphyrogenita, a woman of immense dynastic legitimacy but volatile affections. By 1034 AD, Zoe had become enamored with a young courtier named Michael, a Paphlagonian of low birth but great ambition. Romanos was an obstacle. He was elderly and his health was failing, but he was not dying fast enough for the lovers. The historical record suggests a slow poisoning, a method that mimics the natural decline of age. Romanos's face became swollen, his breathing labored. Yet he lingered. Impatience led to a more direct intervention on Good Friday, April 11th. The emperor decided to visit the baths in the great palace to prepare for the Easter ceremonies. He entered the pool, a place of relaxation and vulnerability. According to the chronicler Michael Sellos, who was a contemporary of these events, the emperor's attendants held his head underwater. It was not a frantic drowning. It was executed under the guise of assisting him. When he was finally pulled out, he was comatose, but technically still alive. He was carried to his bed, where he died shortly after. The official cause was a heart attack or a stroke induced by the heat of the bath. Zoe immediately married Michael, who became Emperor Michael IV. The bathhouse, a symbol of Roman civilization and hygiene, had once again served as the perfect setting for a clean murder. But the wheel of fortune turned quickly in Byzantium. The dynasty of Zoe was plagued by instability. When her adopted son, Michael V, attempted to banish her in 1042, the population of Constantinople rose up. This was not a palace coup, it was a revolution. The mob besieged the palace. Michael V fled to the Studion monastery, clinging to the altar for sanctuary alongside his uncle. The mob was not interested in sanctuary. They dragged the emperor out. However, they did not kill him immediately. In the Byzantine tradition, a deposed emperor was often disqualified from rule by physical mutilation rather than death. Michael was taken to the Sigma, a ceremonial plaza where the executioners gouged out his eyes. He was then banished to a monastery, where he died shortly after, likely from the infection of his wounds. Blinding became the standard, humane alternative to execution, a way to render a political opponent harmless without incurring the mortal sin of murder, though the result was often the same. The tragic end of Romanos IV, Diogenes in 1072, further illustrates this gruesome bureaucratic procedure. Romanos IV is best known for losing the Battle of Manzikert to the Seljuk Turks, a defeat that opened Anatolia to Turkish settlement. He was captured by the Sultan, Alp Arslan, but treated with surprising dignity and released after a treaty was signed. Romanos returned to the empire expecting to resume his rule. Instead, he found that the Ducas family had seized power in his absence. Civil war ensued. Romanos was defeated and forced to surrender on the promise of his safety. The guarantee was signed by 3 metropolitans. He surrendered his sword and was promised a monastic retirement. But the hate of the civil bureaucracy ran deep. Despite the oaths of the bishops, the order came from Constantinople to blind him. The method used was notoriously cruel. It was not done with a hot poker, which cauterizes as it destroys, but with a primitive attempt at surgical removal that caused massive hemorrhaging. The fallen emperor, the man who had stood before the Sultan, was left to rot. His wounds became infected with maggots. He died a slow, agonizing death in a monastery on the island of Proti. It was an assassination by medical malpractice sanctioned by the state. Following the chaos of the late 11th century, the Komnenos dynasty brought a restoration of imperial power. Alexios I Komnenos, a shrewd diplomat and general, managed to die in his bed, though his final hours were marred by his wife and daughter, trying to pressure him to change the succession. However, the end of the Komnenian dynasty a century later offers one of the most terrifying examples of mob violence in Roman history. Andronikos I Komnenos, who took the throne in 1183, was a man of immense charm and terrifying cruelty. He was a populist who purged the aristocracy, staging mass executions to secure his power. He turned Constantinople into a police state. But in 1185, when he attempted to arrest a popular nobleman named Isaac Angelus, the city finally snapped. Isaac killed the arresting agent and rode to the Hagia Sophia to appeal to the people. The dam broke. Andronikos attempted to flee by ship to Russia, but was captured due to calm winds preventing his escape. He was brought back to the city he had terrorized. The new emperor, Isaac II, handed him over to the mob. The description of his death is difficult to read even after 8 centuries. He was tied to a battered camel and paraded through the streets. The citizens threw boiling water and debris at him. Finally, he was hung upside down between 2 pillars in the hippodrome. Despite the torture, he reportedly remained stoic, murmuring, "Lord, have mercy," until he was finally stabbed to death. It was a ritualistic cleansing of the city, an assassination performed by thousands of hands. The Angelos dynasty that followed was characterized by incompetence and fratricide. Isaac II, the man who replaced Andronikos, was himself deposed and blinded by his own brother, Alexios III. This endless infighting left the empire vulnerable to the Fourth Crusade in 1204. The events of 1204 are usually remembered for the sack of the city by the Crusaders, but the catalyst was a sequence of imperial murders. The Crusaders had arrived to place the young Alexios IV on the throne. He succeeded, but he could not pay the money he had promised the Venetian fleet. The city was restless. The treasury was empty. In this power vacuum, a senior official named Alexios Doukas, nicknamed Mortsouflos because of his thick, bushy eyebrows that met in the middle, decided to act. He was the protovestiarios, responsible for the emperor's personal wardrobe and chambers, a position of physical proximity. On the night of January 27, 1204, Mortsouflos tricked the young Emperor Alexios IV into believing a riot had started. He led the terrified boy into a secure room for protection. There, Mortsouflos's agents strangled him with a bowstring. Mortsouflos declared himself Emperor Alexios V. He tried to fight the Crusaders, but failed. When the city fell, he fled, but was later captured by the Latins. The Crusaders, claiming to act as judges for the murder of his predecessor, sentenced him to death. They chose a method that was spectacular and uniquely Roman. They took him to the Forum of Theodosius in the center of the city. There stood a massive commemorative column, nearly 40 meters high. They dragged the usurper to the top of the internal spiral staircase and pushed him off. He fell to the pavement below, a dramatic end to the man who had strangled his master. The empire was shattered, divided between the Latin Empire of Constantinople and the Greek successor states in Nicaea, Epirus, and Trebizond. It would take nearly 60 years for the Greeks of Nicaea to retake the capital in 1261 under Michael VIII Palaiologos. The Palaiologan dynasty, the final ruling family of Rome, faced a different kind of threat. The empire was shrunken, surrounded by enemies on all sides: Serbians, Bulgarians, Turks, and Western Europeans. The stakes were lower in terms of territory, but the internal strife was just as bitter. Assassinations in this period were often linked to the desperate struggle for resources in a dying state. One of the more enigmatic incidents involves the death of the young co-emperor Michael IX Palaiologos in 1320. He did not die by an assassin's blade, but his death was caused by a tragic mistake that feels like a plot from a Greek tragedy. His son, Andronikos III, had a mistress. Jealousy and rivalry led Andronikos III to set a trap for a perceived rival suitor. He ordered his retainers to ambush and kill a man entering the mistress's house at night. Tragically, the man they killed was his own brother, Manuel. The shock of Manuel's murder caused their father, Michael IX, to die of grief, or perhaps a heart attack brought on by the news. It was an accidental double patricide-fratricide that sparked a civil war between the grandfather, Andronikos II, and the grandson, Andronikos III. As the Ottoman Turks advanced, the emperors of Constantinople became increasingly isolated. They were no longer masters of the world, but mayors of a decaying city. Yet the danger remained. John V Palaiologos, who ruled for 50 years in the 14th century, faced rebellions from his son and his grandson. He was imprisoned, escaped, and restored multiple times. The fact that he was not assassinated is more surprising than if he had been. He eventually died of old age, a rare feat, but he died a vassal of the Ottoman Sultan. The final chapter of Imperial Assassinations brings us to the very edge of the fall of the city. But before we reach the last emperor, we must look at the chaotic regency of John VII. In 1390, he seized the throne from his grandfather John V for 5 months. He did so with Ottoman support. The politics of assassination had now shifted from internal Roman affairs to being dictated by foreign powers. If a sultan wanted an emperor removed, he simply supported a rival claimant. The assassin was no longer a Praetorian with a dagger. It was a foreign army waiting outside the walls. In these twilight years, the primary concern was not removing the emperor, but finding someone willing to take the job. The treasury was empty. The crown jewels had been pawned to the Venetians. The lead roof of the palace was sold for cash. To be emperor was to be a captain of a sinking ship, and yet the title still held power. It still commanded loyalty. The final, definitive end of the Roman imperial line would not come through a conspiracy of eunuchs or a mutiny of soldiers. It would come in the heat of the greatest siege the Middle Ages had ever seen. The transition from assassination to martyrdom was about to begin. The final act of the Roman drama was played out not in the shadows of a conspirator's corridor, but on the ramparts of the Theodosian walls. By 1449, when Constantine XI Palaiologos ascended the throne, the empire consisted merely of the city of Constantinople itself and a few scattered territories in the Peloponnese. There was no longer a Praetorian Guard to bribe. There were no wealthy senators to envy. The office of emperor had become a burden so heavy that few sane men would covet it. It is a telling detail of history that Constantine XI was never officially crowned in Constantinople. The religious disputes between the Orthodox and Catholic churches made a coronation ceremony too politically volatile. He reigned as an uncrowned king, a caretaker of the inevitable. In these final years, the threat of assassination vanished, replaced by the certainty of conquest. There were no plots to poison his wine because the cup was already empty. The internal enemies had been replaced entirely by the external siege. On May 29, 1453, the Ottoman forces breached the walls. Constantine XI the heir to Augustus and Trajan, the last in a line of rulers stretching back 1,500 years, tore off his imperial ornaments. He discarded the purple cloak that made him a target. He drew his sword and charged into the thick of the fighting near the gate of St. Romanus. He was never seen again. His body was never positively identified. Unlike Caligula or Commodus, whose bodies were dragged through the streets, or Valerian, who was stuffed with straw, Constantine simply vanished into the dust of history. It was a noble, if violent end, that spared him the humiliation of capture or the degradation of a staged execution. With the fall of the city, the office of the Roman emperor ceased to exist. But if we look back across the centuries we have traversed tonight, a clear and somewhat terrifying pattern emerges. We have looked at dozens of emperors, and the statistics are sobering. Of the approximately 175 men who claimed the title of Roman emperor from Augustus to Constantine XI, roughly 30% were assassinated. Another significant percentage died in battle or were forced to commit suicide. To be a Roman emperor was to hold the most dangerous job in the ancient world. We have seen the evolution of the assassination method, a grim technology of political change. In the early Principate, it was the weapon of the intimate circle. The wife, the doctor, the bodyguard. The danger was domestic. Poisoned mushrooms and strangulation by wrestling partners speak of a court where the public face of power hid a private reality of terror. The palace was a gilded cage where the predator and the prey lived in the same rooms. As the empire militarized in the 3rd century, the method shifted. The dagger was replaced by the sword. The location moved from the dining room to the military tent. The assassin was no longer a stealthy figure in the night, but a mob of angry soldiers demanding their pay. The mutiny assassination became a standard mechanism of election. If an emperor could not deliver victory or gold, his contract was terminated with extreme prejudice. In the Byzantine era, we saw the introduction of theological and bureaucratic nuance. The blinding and the rhinotomy, the cutting of the nose, were attempts to civilize the process of removal. By rendering a man physically imperfect, they hoped to disqualify him from rule without killing him. Yet, as we saw with the brutal death of Andronikos I or the suffocation of Romanos III in the bath, the veneer of civilization was thin. When the stakes were absolute power, the mercy of the monastery was often just a slower form of death. Why did they do it? Why did men continue to step forward to take a job that came with such a guaranteed death sentence? Perhaps it was the belief that they would be the exception. Perhaps it was the sheer intoxication of supreme power, the ability to shape the world with a word. Or perhaps, in a system with no legal method of retirement or succession, there was simply no other way to survive once one had climbed high enough. To step down was to die. To stay was to die. The only choice was to hold on to the wolf's ears for as long as possible. The corridors of the Palatine and the Great Palace are silent now. The noises of the conspiracies, the whispered passwords, the rustle of silk hiding a dagger, the clinking of coins for a bribe, have faded. The marble floors that were once washed clean of imperial blood are now walked upon by tourists. The Praetorian Guard is gone. The Janissaries are gone. The ambition that drove men to murder their brothers and fathers has been quieted by the passage of time. In the end, the history of imperial assassinations is a testament to the fragility of power. No amount of guards, no height of walls, and no divine title could protect these men from the consequences of their position. They were the masters of the world, yet they could not master their own safety. It is a reminder that in the grand sweep of history, even the loudest shouts of command are eventually silenced. So as we leave the ghosts of the Caesars to their rest, let us be grateful for the quiet and the mundane. We do not need to check our cups for poison. We do not need to fear the guard standing at our door. We can close our eyes without the fear that we will not be allowed to open them again. That brings us to the end of our journey tonight. I hope you found this exploration of Roman history suitably relaxing in its distance from our own lives. If you are still awake and finding it difficult to fall asleep, I can share one more boring history topic with you. I hope that while listening to this, you will drift into a deep and peaceful sleep. Perhaps subscribing to my channel and liking the video might even help you fall asleep. So, let's move on to our next topic. Now, back in time to step inside the scented, quiet workshop of a Roman healer, observing the slow, careful work of ancient medicine. To experience the day of a healer in Rome, we must first adjust our senses to a different scale of the city. We are not looking at the vast marble expanse of the Forum or the deafening roar of the Colosseum. Instead, we are navigating the narrow, shadowed streets of the Subura or the Trastevere district, places where the air is thick with the scent of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and cooking oil. Here, amidst the daily struggle for survival, the medicus, the doctor, carves out a space of order and precarious science. Our day begins before the sun has fully risen. The Roman day is dictated by light, and for a man whose work requires the precision of sight, the morning hours are the most valuable. Our healer, let us imagine him as a man of Greek extraction, perhaps a freedman who learned his trade as an apprentice to a master in his youth, wakes in a small room behind or above his shop. This shop, the Taberna Medica, opens directly onto the street. It is a space that serves as a waiting room, an operating theater, and a pharmacy all in one. The first task of the morning is not to attend to a patient, but to attend to the tools. In the dim light of an oil lamp, the healer moves to his workbench. The tools of Roman medicine are objects of stark, functional beauty, usually crafted from bronze or steel. He unrolls a leather case, revealing a set of instruments that would be surprisingly recognizable to a modern surgeon, yet distinctly ancient in their craftsmanship. There are scalps, or scalpellum, of various sizes, their blades needing to be kept razor sharp. There are bone levers, hooks for retracting tissue, and forceps, some with smooth jaws for delicate work, others with toothed grips for extracting bone fragments or arrowheads. He picks up a bronze probe, the spicillum. It is cold to the touch. He inspects it for any sign of verdigris or rust. In a world without germ theory, cleanliness is not understood as sterilization, but as a visible purity. A rusty tool is a bad tool. He wipes it down with a cloth soaked in olive oil and perhaps a bit of vinegar. The repetitive motion of cleaning these instruments is a meditative start to the day. The scrape of the cloth against the metal is the only sound in the room. Once the tools are arranged, laid out on a clean linen cloth in order of likely use, he turns his attention to the mortarium. This is the heavy bowl, usually made of coarse pottery or stone, used for grinding. The air in the shop is permanently infused with a complex medicinal aroma. It is a smell of dried sage, rosemary, garlic, burnt wool, and the metallic tang of copper. Before the first patient arrives, he must prepare the day's supply of basic remedies. He takes a handful of dried poppy tears, opium, and begins to grind them. This will be mixed with wine to create a painkiller for the difficult cases. He measures out frankincense and myrrh, not for religious offering, but for their antiseptic properties in wound dressing. He checks his supply of honey, the universal binder and healer of the ancient world. Honey is poured into jars, ready to be slathered onto ulcers or mixed with crushed minerals. As the shutters of the shop are unbarred and the noise of the street begins to filter in, the rumble of carts, the shouting of water carriers, the healer prepares himself mentally. He is not just a technician, he is a performer of sorts. In Rome, medicine is a competitive marketplace. There are no degrees, no licensing boards, and no guaranteed salaries. A doctor's reputation is his only currency. He must look the part. He adjusts his tunic, ensuring it is clean. He washes his hands in a basin of water. He adopts an air of gravitas, a serious, calming demeanor that assures the patient that he understands the hidden workings of the body. The medical philosophy that guides his hands is based on the balance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. He believes that health is the equilibrium of these fluids, and illness is their dysregulation. When he looks at a patient, he is not looking for a virus or a bacteria. He is looking for an excess of heat, a surplus of moisture, or a stagnation of cold. His entire day will be an exercise in trying to restore this invisible balance through diet, drugs, and the knife. The first patient of the day arrives with the morning light. It is a common case, a laborer from the nearby river docks with an infected wound on his leg. The man limps in, supported by a friend. The healer gestures for him to sit on a wooden stool in the center of the room. The light from the open street door falls onto the leg. The healer does not rush. He touches the skin around the wound, gauging the heat. Calor, rubor, tumor, dolor, heat, redness, swelling, pain. These are the signs he reads. He speaks quietly to the man, asking about his diet, his sleep, and his bowel movements. To a modern ear, these questions might seem irrelevant to a leg wound, but to the Roman healer, the wound is merely a symptom of a body that is struggling to cope. He washes the wound with warm wine, the alcohol acting as a disinfectant, though he thinks of it as drying the wound. He then reaches for a jar of salve he prepared earlier, perhaps a mixture of lead oxide and olive oil, or a paste of honey and turpentine. He applies the salve with a spatula, his movements practiced and efficient. He does not wince at the smell of the infection. He has smelled it 1,000 times. He binds the leg with strips of linen, wrapping it tight enough to provide support, but not so tight as to cut off the spiritus, the life force moving through the limb. He instructs the laborer to avoid wine and to eat only light foods like barley gruel. He takes a small coin as payment, a few asses or a denarius if the man is flush. As the laborer leaves, the shop is quiet again for a moment. The healer cleans the basin. This is the rhythm of his life, the intake of suffering, the application of order, the cleaning of the aftermath. But not all work happens in the shop. By mid-morning, he must leave the taberna to make his rounds. The wealthier clients do not come to him. He goes to them. He packs a smaller leather satchel with his essential tools and a selection of picksides, small wooden or ivory boxes containing pills and powders. He steps out into the Roman street. The noise is immediate and overwhelming, but he moves through it with the detached focus of a professional. He walks past the food stalls selling hot sausages, past the schoolmaster shouting at his pupils on a street corner, and heads toward the more respectable houses on the slopes of the hills. Walking through the city is part of the job. A doctor in Rome is a pedestrian. As he walks, he observes the health of the populace. He sees the swollen eyes of the children playing in the dust. Ophthalmia is rampant in the dusty, bright city. He sees the bowed legs of the elderly, the skin diseases of the beggars. The city itself is a patient, one that is perpetually sick. His destination is the domus of a minor equestrian family. The paterfamilias, the head of the household, has been complaining of a fever and a pain in his side. When the healer arrives, he is ushered past the slave doorkeeper, through the atrium with its impluvium catching the rain, and into the small, dark bedroom, the cubiculum. Here, the dynamic changes. In his shop, the healer is the master of his domain. In the rich man's house, he is a servant, albeit a highly skilled one. He must be deferential. He sits by the bedside and takes the patient's pulse. The study of the pulse is a high art in Roman medicine. He feels for the rhythm, the strength, the speed. Is it ant-like? Is it gazelle-like? These are the metaphors used to describe the fluttering of the artery. He places his hand on the man's forehead. He examines the tongue. He asks to see a sample of the patient's urine, which a slave brings in a glass vessel. Uroscopy, the visual inspection of urine, is a critical diagnostic tool. He holds it up to the light, checking the color, the clarity, and the sediment. He is looking for signs of uncooked digestion, of bile, of internal bleeding. He diagnoses a tertian fever, likely malaria, which is endemic to Rome due to the nearby marshes. There is no cure, only management. He prescribes a cooling diet, cucumber, endive, and plenty of water. He forbids the heating comforts of wine and red meat. He may leave a small packet of dried herbs, wormwood or centauri, to be steeped in water. He speaks with authority, reassuring the anxious wife that the crisis will pass. Much of his work is simply this: the management of anxiety in the face of the unknown. Leaving the cool quiet of the domus, he steps back into the glare of the noon sun. The morning rounds are done, but the day is only half over. The afternoon will bring different challenges, perhaps necessitating the use of the bronze knife that sits cold and sharp in his bag. Returning to the Taberna Medica. In the heat of the early afternoon, the healer finds a brief respite. The city of Rome slows down during the 6th and 7th hours, the sun beating down on the paving stones, driving those who can afford it into the cool recesses of their homes or the public baths. For the healer, this is a time for maintenance and the simple fuel of a working man's lunch. He sits on a stool in the back of the shop, eating a piece of crusty bread dipped in watered-down wine, perhaps accompanied by a few olives or a piece of salted fish. He is not alone in the shop. With him is an apprentice, a young slave purchased specifically for his dexterity and intelligence. Medical knowledge in Rome is passed down from master to student, hand to hand. There are no universities, no formal anatomy lectures. The apprentice learns by watching, by grinding the powders, and by holding the patients down when the knife is necessary. While the healer eats, he quizzes the boy on the properties of the herbs hanging from the ceiling rafters. He points to a bundle of dried willow bark used for pain and inflammation, and asks for the correct dosage for a child versus a man. The boy answers quietly, reciting the knowledge that will one day buy his freedom. The quiet of the afternoon is broken by the arrival of a new patient. This is not a man with a fever or a wound, but a man in the grip of a relentless, throbbing agony, a toothache. In the ancient world, dental problems are a ubiquitous misery. The grit from the stone-ground flour wears down enamel, and without modern hygiene, decay is rampant. The man is a baker, his face swollen on one side, his eyes red from lack of sleep. He has tried the folk remedies, holding a frog against his jaw in the moonlight, rinsing his mouth with vinegar and ash, but nothing has worked. He has come to the medicus as a last resort. The healer finishes his meal and wipes his hands. He approaches the baker, who is seated in the operating chair, a sturdy, high-backed wooden chair with handles for gripping. The healer peers into the man's mouth. The breath is foul, the sign of rotting pulp. He taps the offending tooth with a metal probe. The baker flinches violently. The diagnosis is clear. The tooth must come out. There is no anesthesia in the modern sense. There is no needle to numb the nerve. The healer offers the man a cup of strong, unmixed wine, perhaps laced with a small amount of henbane to dull the senses, but the pain will still be real. The procedure is a test of endurance for the patient and a test of strength and control for the doctor. The healer selects his instrument. It is a pair of forceps, the forceps dentalis, made of iron with serrated beaks designed to grip the slippery surface of the tooth. He explains the process to the baker in a low, calm voice. He does not lie about the pain, but he promises speed. He instructs the apprentice to stand behind the chair and hold the baker's head firmly against the headrest. The stability of the head is crucial. A sudden jerk could cause the jaw to fracture, or the instrument to slip and gouge the cheek. The healer positions himself. He scours the gum around the tooth with a small blade to separate the flesh from the bone. Then he inserts the forceps. He clamps them down low on the tooth, near the root. The metal clinks against the enamel. He does not pull immediately. Instead, he begins to rock the tooth back and forth, loosening the periodontal ligament that binds it to the jaw. This is the longest part of the process, a slow, grinding battle of leverage. The baker groans, his knuckles white as he grips the chair arms. The healer remains focused, his face impassive, his wrist moving with calculated force. With a final, sharp twist and an upward pull, the resistance gives way. The tooth comes free with a wet snap. Blood fills the mouth. The healer works quickly now, handing the patient a sponge soaked in vinegar and cold water to bite down on. The pressure stems the bleeding. He examines the extracted tooth, checking to see if the roots are intact. If a root has broken off inside the jaw, it could lead to a deeper infection, requiring him to dig it out with a bone elevator, a complication he wishes to avoid. Satisfied that the extraction is clean, he gives the baker further instructions. He is to rinse his mouth with wine and saffron and to avoid solid food for 2 days. The baker, pale and shaking but relieved of the throbbing pressure, pays his fee and stumbles out into the street. The healer drops the bloody tooth into a bucket of refuse and hands the forceps to the apprentice to be scrubbed and oiled. It is a brutal business, but a necessary one. With the surgery complete, the healer turns his attention to the more commercial aspect of his trade, the preparation of medicines for sale. A significant portion of a Roman doctor's income comes not from fees for service, but from the sale of salves, pills, and powders. The shelves of his shop are lined with picksides, small boxes, and ceramic jars, each labeled with a tag. He moves to the mortarium, the heavy stone mortar. He begins to prepare a batch of collyrium, an eye salve. Eye diseases are incredibly common in the dusty, bright, and fly-ridden Mediterranean, and a good eye doctor, or oculist, can make a fortune. He takes a stick of cadmia, zinc oxide, and grinds it into a fine white powder. To this, he adds dried saffron for inflammation, opium for pain, and gum arabic to bind it all together. He mixes it with rainwater until it forms a thick paste. He rolls this paste into long, thin sticks, like small pencils. He stamps each stick with his personal seal while it is still soft. This stamp is his trademark, a guarantee of quality in a market flooded with counterfeits. These sticks will be sold to patients who will grind them down at home, mix them with egg white or milk, and apply them to their sore eyes. The rhythmic grinding of the pestle against the mortar is a hypnotic sound that fills the quiet intervals of the afternoon. As he works, he watches the street. he sees a rival healer walking past, a man who claims to cure epilepsy with the burnt blood of gladiator moles. The Roman medical marketplace is unregulated and cutthroat. There are serious physicians who follow the teachings of Hippocrates and Galen, and there are charlatans, poison sellers, and magicians. Our healer must constantly navigate this landscape, distinguishing himself by his professionalism, the cleanliness of his shop, and the success of his cures. He knows that one bad outcome, one high-profile death, can ruin a reputation that took decades to build. The afternoon wears on. The shadows lengthen across the street. A slave from a nearby laundry comes in to buy a jar of pitch and pork fat for a skin rash. A mother brings a child with a cough, and the healer prescribes a syrup of horehound and honey. These are the small, undramatic transactions that keep the shop running. As the sun begins to dip towards the horizon, signaling the approach of the dinner hour, the healer prepares for one final task. He has a patient staying in the back room, a man recovering from a more serious procedure performed days ago, perhaps a hernia repair or the removal of a bladder stone. Rome has no hospitals in the modern sense. The valetudinarium exists only for soldiers and slaves on large estates. For the free population, serious recovery happens at home or in the back rooms of doctors' shops. He steps into the small, windowless room behind the main shop. The air here is close and still, smelling faintly of vinegar and stale wine. The patient, a man in his 30s, is lying on a simple cot made of a wooden frame strung with ropes and covered with a wool mattress. He is recovering from the removal of a bladder stone, a cutting for the stone, which is one of the most dangerous and delicate operations a surgeon can perform. The healer approaches the cot with a small oil lamp in his hand. The flame casts long, dancing shadows on the plaster walls. The patient is awake, his eyes tracking the light. He is in pain, but the fact that he is awake and alert is a good sign. In the days before antibiotics, the greatest enemy is not the knife, but what follows: the fever, the swelling, the corruption of the flesh that the Greeks call gangrene. The healer pulls back the linen sheet to inspect the incision. He brings the lamp closer, the heat of the flame almost touching the skin. He is looking for the telltale signs of infection, a darkening of the edges, a discharge of pus, or the angry red streaks of blood poisoning. He leans in and sniffs the wound. To a Roman doctor, the nose is a diagnostic instrument as important as the eye. He is looking for a smell that is earthy or sweet like rotting fruit. Instead, he smells only the copper tang of drying blood and the sharp scent of the medicinal salve applied yesterday. Satisfied, he nods to the patient. He takes a sponge soaked in warm water and gently dabs the area around the incision. He applies a fresh dressing, a pad of soft wool soaked in olive oil and wine. The oil prevents the wool from sticking to the healing flesh, and the wine keeps the wound dry. He checks the patient's urine collection vessel, noting the color and volume. It is clear. The kidneys are working. The man will likely live. Leaving the back room, the healer returns to the front of the shop. The light outside is fading rapidly now, turning from the harsh white of the afternoon to a deep, dusty violet. The noise of the street is changing. The heavy carts, banned from the city streets during the daylight hours, are beginning to rumble into motion. The shouts of merchants are replaced by the chatter of people heading to dinner or the taverns. It is time to close the taberna. Security is a real concern in Rome. There is no police force to patrol these streets, only the vigils, who are more concerned with fires than burglaries. The healer's shop contains valuable items, drugs like opium and saffron, high-quality bronze tools, and the coin box. He begins the ritual of locking up. First, he sweeps the floor, pushing the dust and dried herbs out the door. Then, he takes the heavy wooden shutters that act as the shop window. He slots them into the grooves of the stone sill. They are heavy, solid planks of oak, reinforced with iron bands. He slides the locking bar into place with a dull thud. The shop is plunged into darkness, illuminated only by the single lamp on his workbench. The world of the street is shut out, its noise muffled to a dull roar. He moves to the small strong box hidden beneath the counter. He counts the day's earnings. It has been a moderate day. A handful of bronze sestertii, a few silver denarii from the house call, and a copper aes from the slave. He records the amount on a wax tablet, scratching the numerals into the soft beeswax with a stylus. He is meticulous about his accounts. He is a businessman as much as a healer, and he must pay rent to the landlord who owns the Insula block. With the shop secure, the healer retires to his own living quarters, which are essentially a corner of the shop, partitioned off by a curtain or perhaps a small mezzanine level above the workspace. His own dinner, the cena, is a solitary and simple affair. He does not recline on a couch like the wealthy patrons he visited earlier. He sits on a stool at a small round table. His meal consists of a pottage of lentils or chickpeas, seasoned with olive oil and perhaps a bit of coriander. He tears off a chunk of bread to scoop it up. He might have a small piece of cheese or some figs. He drinks wine, but it is heavily watered down. A surgeon cannot afford to have shaking hands in the morning. As he eats, the physical labor of the day catches up with him. His back aches from bending over the operating chair. His eyes are tired from squinting at wounds and scales. But the evening also offers the only time for intellectual engagement. Roman medicine is a learned profession. It relies on the texts of the masters, Hippocrates, Celsus, Dioscorides, and the rising star, Galen. He finishes his meal and wipes the table. He reaches for a scroll case on a shelf. He carefully extracts a papyrus scroll. It is brittle and valuable. He unrolls it gently, weighing the edges down with clean stones. He reads by the flickering light of the lamp. Perhaps he is reading a treatise on the setting of fractured bones, or a catalogue of herbal remedies from the East. He mouths the Greek words silently to himself. He is checking his own observations of the day against the wisdom of the ancients. Did he bandage that leg correctly? Was the dosage of poppy juice too high? The room is quiet, save for the scratching of mice in the walls and the occasional shout from the street outside. In this small circle of light, the healer is connected to a tradition of knowledge that stretches back hundreds of years. He is a student of nature, trying to impose a rational order on the chaotic reality of the human body. He makes a few notes on his wax tablet, a reminder to buy more linen tomorrow, a note to check on the baker's jaw in 2 days. The lamp oil is running low. The flame sputters, casting erratic shadows. It is time to sleep. The Roman day starts early, and tomorrow will bring new fevers, new wounds, and new anxieties to his door. He blows out the lamp. The smell of the extinguished wick, acrid and smoky, mixes with the lingering scent of the herbs. He lies down on his pallet, pulling a wool blanket over himself. The darkness is complete. The sleep of a healer is rarely deep, and tonight it is short. Long before the sun threatens the eastern horizon, while the city is still wrapped in the cool blue-black blanket of the final watch of the night, the healer opens his eyes. He is not woken by a knocking at the door this time, but by the internal clock of a man who knows that the best business is done before the chaos of the day begins. Today is a market day, and the taberna is low on essential supplies. To be a doctor in Rome is to be part scientist, part craftsman and part merchant. He cannot cure without his raw materials. He rises in the darkness, splashing cold water from a basin onto his face. He dresses quickly, putting on a sturdier pair of sandals and wrapping a heavier cloak over his tunic to ward off the pre-dawn chill. He takes his money pouch, checking the weight of the silver denarii against his palm. He also takes a small, sharp knife, tucking it into his belt, not for surgery, but for cutting open samples to check for purity. He steps out of the shop, locking the heavy bar behind him. The street is different now. The silence of the middle night has given way to a low, industrious hum. The bakers have been awake for hours. The smell of wood smoke and baking bread drifts from their ovens, a warm, yeasty promise in the cool air. The heavy carts that supply the city are rumbling towards the gates, their drivers eager to leave before the ban on wheeled traffic comes into force at sunrise. Our healer heads towards the Horea Piperitaria, the great pepper and spice warehouses located near the Forum. This is the heart of the empire's luxury trade, where the caravans from the east and the ships from Egypt offload their precious cargoes. He walks briskly, keeping to the center of the street to avoid the waste that may have been thrown from upper windows during the night. As he approaches the market district, the smell hits him before he sees the stalls. It is a complex, heady wall of scent that overpowers the usual Roman odors of refuse and drains. It smells of cinnamon from Taprobane, frankincense from Arabia, pepper from India, and strange, pungent gums from Africa. To the healer, this is not just perfume. It is a pharmacy. The market is already bustling with wholesale activity. He moves through the crowd of merchants, porters, and fellow apothecaries. He is looking for a specific trader, a Syrian named Malchus, who has a reputation for honest weights and unadulterated goods. In the medical trade, counterfeit drugs are a plague. Ground chalk is sold as white lead, goat fat is passed off as bear grease, and stale herbs are dyed to look fresh. The healer must trust his nose and his eyes above all else. He finds Malchus's stall near a stone pillar. The merchant greets him with a nod. They do not waste time with pleasantries. The transaction is serious. The healer needs opium, the dried latex of the poppy. It is the most important drug in his arsenal, the only thing that stands between his patients and unbearable pain. Malchus produces a small, leather-wrapped cake of the dark, sticky substance. The healer takes it. He smells it. It should have a heavy, narcotic scent, nauseating to some, but sweet to him. He uses his knife to slice a thin shaving from the center. He rolls it between his thumb and forefinger, checking the texture. It should be pliable, not brittle. He tastes a tiny crumb. It is bitterly acrid. Satisfied, he nods. They haggle briefly over the price, settling on a sum that is high but fair. Next, he needs laser-pychium, or at least the Cyrenaican variety having vanished, the Persian substitute. This resin is crucial for treating digestive ailments and colic. He inspects a jar of the golden brown gum. He holds a piece up to the torchlight to check for clarity. He also buys a bag of dried Egyptian linen for bandages. The linen must be old and soft, not new and stiff. Old linen absorbs blood better and is kinder to inflamed skin. His final purchase is a small jar of Attic honey, renowned for its thickness and thyme-scented purity. Honey is the vehicle for almost all his liquid medicines. It masks the bitter taste of herbs and coats the throat. He watches closely as the merchant ladles it into his own ceramic jar, ensuring that no water is added to bulk it out. Laden with his supplies, the healer turns away from the market. The sky is beginning to lighten now, the deep purple turning to a bruised gray. The grand columns of the Forum are reclaiming their color, shifting from silhouettes to white marble. But instead of returning directly to his shop, He turns towards the river. He crosses the Pons Fabricius, the oldest bridge in Rome, heading towards the Insula Tiberina, Tiber Island. This ship-shaped island in the middle of the river is a place apart. It is dedicated to Aesculapius, the god of healing. It is the spiritual center of his profession. While he relies on his knife and his herbs, he is a Roman, and he knows that ultimately the favor of the gods dictates the outcome. The island is quiet, separated from the noise of the city by the rushing waters of the Tiber. He approaches the great temple of Aesculapius. The air here is filled with a different scent, not spices, but burning wax and the clean smell of the river. The temple courtyard is crowded, even at this hour. Under the porticos lie the sick and the desperate. They are practicing incubation, sleeping in the temple precincts, in the hope that the god will visit them in a dream and reveal a cure. The healer walks past them slowly. He sees the hopeful faces, the twisted limbs, the eyes bright with fever. He does not mock them. He knows that hope is a powerful medicine in itself. He approaches the altar and drops a few coins into the offering box. He murmurs a silent prayer to the god, asking for a steady hand and a clear mind. He asks that his diagnoses be true and his knife be swift. It is a moment of professional centering, a reminder that he is a servant of a force larger than himself. He pauses to look at the sacred snakes kept in the temple gardens, slithering lazily over the warm stones. They are the symbol of the god, shedding their skin just as the patient sheds their illness. The sight of them is considered a good omen. Turning back towards the bridge, the sun finally breaks over the hills of Rome. The light hits the water, turning the Tiber into a ribbon of gold. The city is fully awake now. The roar of the waking giant is audible even here. The healer adjusts the strap of his bag on his shoulder. His break is over. The supplies on his back will be turned into salves and powders before noon. There are wounds waiting to be dressed, fevers waiting to be cooled, and pain waiting to be soothed. He crosses the bridge, merging back into the stream of humanity flowing into the city. He is just one man in a city of 1,000,000, a small point of order in a chaotic world. But as he walks, he straightens his back. He has his tools. He has his knowledge. And the day is just beginning. Returning from the island of Aesculapius, the healer finds the city has fully shed the lethargy of the night. The streets are now a dense current of tunics and togas. He navigates the flow with the instinct of a local, protecting his bag of precious spices from the jostle of the crowd. When he reaches his taberna, he finds the shutters already thrown open. His apprentice has swept the threshold and sprinkled water on the dusty floor to keep the air cool. The boy is currently grinding charcoal in a small bowl, a task that leaves his fingers stained black. Charcoal is used for stomach ailments and to sweeten the breath. It is a humble remedy, but a popular one. The healer sets his purchases on the workbench. The sight of the fresh opium cake, the clear honey, and the resin brings a sense of satisfaction. These are the raw materials of his art. Before the first patient of the mid-morning rush arrives, he takes a moment to instruct the apprentice on the processing of the dried linen. He shows the boy how to tear the fabric along the grain to create long, even bandages, and how to roll them tightly so they can be deployed with one hand during a procedure. It is a lesson in tactile memory. The hands must know what to do before the mind can command them. The first case of the late morning is a slave girl sent by the mistress of a nearby household. She holds her arm awkwardly against her chest. A cooking accident. A pot of boiling oil had splashed. The healer gently examines the burn. The skin is blistered and angry. This is a common injury in a city where cooking is done over open fires in cramped kitchens. He does not reach for the knife. For a burn, the goal is to exclude the air and prevent the corruption of the flesh. He takes the jar of Attic honey he purchased only an hour ago. He mixes it with a little bit of pork fat to create an occlusive paste. He spreads this thickly over a piece of the soft old linen. He applies it to the arm. The girl flinches, then relaxes as the cool mixture covers the heat of the burn. He bandages it loosely. He gives her instructions to keep it dry and tells her to return in 3 days. There is no magic here, just the preservation of the body's own ability to heal. As the sun climbs to its zenith, the heat in the small shop rises. The smells of the drugs intensify. The sharp tang of vinegar, the heavy sweetness of the opium, the resinous scent of the pine pitch. The healer wipes his brow. The pace of the day slows as the city enters the afternoon lull. During this quiet time, a different kind of visitor arrives. It is not a patient, but a colleague of sorts, a midwife or obstetrics. In the Roman medical ecosystem, the divide between male doctors and female midwives is distinct but permeable. They often rely on each other. She has come to purchase a supply of clean sponges and a specific mixture of herbs used to stem bleeding. They speak for a few minutes in the low, professional tones of people who deal constantly with the messy realities of biology. They discuss the outbreak of a summer fever in the lower districts and the quality of the water from the Claudian aqueduct. It is a brief exchange of intelligence, a reinforcement of the informal network that keeps the city's health in check. After she leaves, the healer settles onto his stool. He picks up the piece of opium he bought from Malchus. He begins the delicate work of dividing it into doses. He uses a small bronze balance scale, weighing out tiny pellets of the dark gum. Each pellet is a potential release from agony, but a fraction too much is a ticket to the underworld. He works with absolute focus. The balance pans tip and settle. He rolls the pellets in a dusting of licorice powder to stop them from sticking together. As he works, he reflects on his place in this vast, stone-devouring machine that is Rome. He is not a general who conquers provinces. He is not a senator who debates laws. He is a mechanic of the human frame. The empire is built on the backs of legionaries, the arms of laborers, and the minds of administrators. But bodies break. They wear out. They are susceptible to the damp air of the marsh and the sharp edge of the sword. His job is to patch them up, to oil the gears, to keep the machine running for one more day, one more year. He looks at his hands. They are stained with ink, with iodine, with the juice of herbs. They are the hands of a worker. In a society that often despises manual labor, the physician occupies a strange middle ground, valued for his mind, yet working with the blood and filth of life. He accepts this. There is a dignity in the immediate utility of his trade. When a man is screaming with a toothache, he does not care about the philosophy of Plato. He cares about the man with the forceps. The light begins to change again, lengthening across the floorboards. The sounds of the evening commute begin to rise. The shop has seen its quota of suffering and relief for the day. The healer packs away the scale. He puts the new opium pellets into a box of ivory. He instructs the apprentice to cover the jars. The day is ending. The shutter bar is lifted. The heavy wood blocks out the street once more. The lamp is lit. The cycle is complete. Tomorrow, the sun will rise over the Sabine hills. The carts will roll. The furnaces will be lit. And the people of Rome will wake up with their ailments, their injuries, and their fears. And he will be here, in his small shop, smelling of spices and vinegar, ready to listen to the pulse of the world. We leave him now, in the quiet of his sanctuary, surrounded by his tools and his jars, a guardian of the fragile frontier between health and sickness. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the daily life of the ancient world. I hope the quiet rhythms of the healer's day have helped you find your own sense of calm. The city of Rome sleeps now, and so should you. Good night.